بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أسعد الله مساءكم جميعا. يسر إدارتي مراجعة أداء المدارس الحكومية ومراجعة أداء المدارس الخاصة ورياض الأطفال بهيئة جودة التعليم والتدريب الترحيب بكم في هذا المنتدى الإلكتروني، والذي يقام تحت عنوان حوار نقدي: التحديات والفرص لسد فجوة الإنجاز لدى الطلبة. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Directorate of Government Schools and Private Schools and Kindergarten Reviews at the Education and Training Quality Authority, I would like to welcome you all into this webinar entitled Critical Dialogue: The Challenges and Opportunities for Bridging the Students' Gap. تعقد اليوم جلستان مدة كل منها 30 دقيقة، ويتبعهما 10 دقائق لتلقي الإجابات على أسئلة الحضور، على أن يتم في نهاية المنتدى رفع التوصيات الختامية. كما نستقبل الأسئلة والتعليقات باللغتين العربية والإنجليزية من خلال خانة Q&A طوال فترة المنتدى. الحضور الكريم، نود إبلاغكم بأنه سوف يتم تحميل النسخ العربية والإنجليزية من العروض التقديمية لهذا اليوم على موقع هيئة جودة التعليم والتدريب www.bqa.gov.bh. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 sessions today, around 30 minutes each. That would be followed by 10 minutes dedicated for questions and answers. Finally, we will be concluding with the webinar's recommendation. Your input, whether it's a question or a comment, in both English and Arabic, is welcomed through the sessions. Kindly use the Q&A for this purpose. Both presentations of the day will be uploaded on BQA website www.bqa.gov.bh in both English and Arabic. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start our first session, entitled Thinking about Immediate Responses and Long-Term Changes to the COVID-19 Pandemic, Supporting Students and Teachers During the Crisis and Beyond. This session is presented by Professor David Gore, who is a professor in educational leadership at the University of Melbourne, Australia. David has extensive international publications and conference presentations and an academic career of over 25 years. All of us, willing and ready to hear from you, David. The mic is yours.
Thank you for that. I'll just share my screen.
Please do.
Good.
That's
fantastic. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm coming from to you from Melbourne in Australia. It's the land of the Wurundjeri people in terms of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I'd like to pay my respect to them. So my concern today is to both think about what COVID has done in terms of education, but really to encourage you to think beyond that, to consider what comes after we get through this period of crisis. And so we will look at some evidence about the impact of the pandemic on education. And then we'll consider what education and educational leadership might look like in the future. And I have a tool for us to think, to help us do that thinking. It's looking at best practice and next practice, and I'll take you through that. The presentation that you can download, it also has been written up in a chapter, which has just been published just a month or so ago, and you'll have the details of that, and you'll be able to get a version of that, a pre-publication version, on my ResearchGate and academia web pages. There are also some journal issues that I'll be referring to, and these will be freely available as well. And again, details will be on the presentation. So if there are things that you want to follow up, there'll be some reading that you can use to follow up with, or you can get in touch with me. My details are on the presentation as well. I'm happy to talk to you over email. I've just put up this slide to begin, and this is data that's over a year old now, and it just highlights some of the impact of the first year of the pandemic. More importantly, I like the little diagram that they have, and in this particular publication, they talked about, and this is Insights for Education, they talked about how systems around the world were having to balance education with the economy impact and with the health impact. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we talk about this. So we're constantly negotiating this balancing act. And at times we prioritize the health, at times we prioritize the economy, and hopefully at times we prioritize education. In terms of the impact, one of the things that I did, I have been, and I've just published my last issue of International Studies in Educational Administration. This is a journal of the Commonwealth Council for Educational Administration and Management, and the journal is now publishing its 50th volume. So it's one of the old journals in the educational leadership field. And as editor of the journal, I was able to quickly respond to the pandemic and dedicate 4 issues to capture some of the knowledge about what was happening. And so over these four issues, there were 29 countries represented in nearly 60 papers. So 59 papers across the 4 issues, and as I said, from all around the world. So it gave a sense of what was happening during 2020. And then since then, of course, we're getting lots of information about how countries are responding and so forth. And I'll mention just a couple of very recent bits of information later on in the presentation. When we look at what's been happening around the world, there have been positive impacts of the pandemic, and we need to take these into account. So adaptation has been one of them. Professionals, education professionals at all levels have been able to adapt very quickly. It's been quite extraordinary to watch how schools, for example, can be closed 1 week and then opened a few weeks later, and the educators have been able to maintain continuity. As part of that, there's been a whole array of technology that has helped. And of course, not every country has access to all the technology, but it has been interesting to see the array. So yes, we've seen remote learning, and we've seen things from printed material right through to the highest level of technology and internet use. So in some contexts, which don't have access to the internet and so forth, printed material has been important. It's been interesting to note that countries such as India have reverted to TV as a medium of instruction. And that's something that hasn't been used in many countries for quite some time on a major level. So again, the use of technology. There has been increased teacher collaboration and leadership from many. And so we've talked about distributed leadership for many years, and the pandemic has certainly brought this to the fore, that people have stepped up, have taken on leadership roles, even when they weren't in defined leadership positions. And there's been a focus on the important work of teachers broadly. And at the university level, a renewed focus on teaching. But this sense that teachers matter, I think that's been brought to the fore. And related to this is that schools as institutions, as important institutions in society, have also had their place brought to prominence again. So people understand, if they needed any reminding, that schools are an important part of our societies. And they have many roles, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that in just a moment. There's also been, for students with diverse needs, there's been innovative solutions to meet their needs, and some of these have been technology driven. And one of the nice things that has happened is that we're seeing people looking at students at an individual level and saying, well, how do we support them? Related to that, there's been this greater connection between schools, families, and communities. Now, along with the positives, of course, there are many negatives, and these will be familiar to you. One of the great negative impacts has been the educational inequities have been exposed. So we're seeing this both within countries and across countries. And it's particularly prominent in areas where families have low incomes and countries that have low GDPs. Rural, remote areas have been impacted. Students with diverse needs have not always been catered for. So these inequities have really come to the fore. The health and welfare of students has been a huge problem in many contexts. School closures have been, in many countries, have been a major source of concern. Simply because in many contexts, the school provides the main meal of the day for students. The school provides health and welfare services for students. And when they're closed, those no longer exist. And there may be long-term impact on student development from the discontinuity, but again, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, and I think Parsi is going to be talking about this later. The evidence about this is uncertain, and it really is fairly context specific. For teachers, it's been a stressful time. For students, it's been a stressful time. For families, it's been a stressful time. And that notion of continuity of education been enormously stressful in terms of people providing this. Teachers have reported increased workload, work intensification. Principals have also reported this. So the work has become more intense for those that are working. In some jurisdictions, though, when the schools shut, the jobs stopped. Teachers stopped getting paid in some countries. And so that's a major concern as well. Remote learning in jurisdictions where it's happened has been fine, but there are some issues with that. And one of them, particularly at the university level, is assessment integrity. So how do you conduct tests through remote means? And then we come down to the students' learning and well-being, which is central to what we're doing in education. And again, the evidence about this is quite context specific. And so I'm just going to put up a few bits of evidence just to stimulate your thinking about this. This is from McKinsey and Company. This is a teacher survey that was done last year. I think it was a 220 survey published last year. And this is really saying that teachers believe that students were on average 2 months behind where they usually would have been as a result of COVID. And this is across many countries. And not surprisingly, that the learning loss was linked to the length of school closure. Okay? And then school closure is an interesting concept. So in Australia, for example, New South Wales, where Parsi is, and Sydney, where he is at the moment, and Melbourne and Victoria, they experienced the greatest amount of lockdown of schools. A state like Western Australia almost had no lockdown, just 2 or 3 weeks. So again, even within a country, the amount of lockdown can be great. In Victoria, over 2 years, we lost 1 year of schooling to lockdowns. No, sorry, that's wrong. We had schools shut physically for 1 year. We switched to remote learning though, so learning continued, but the physical school was shut for over a year across the 2 years. In this OECD report, they talked about the psychological well-being of children not declining to any great extent during lockdowns. And they also talked about that there were some for severe mental or psychological disorders, they may have increased, but they're saying that for typical well-being, there wasn't a great impact. And they talked about the limited and conflicting evidence about learning loss. Okay. They did, though, talk about that in less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, there were greater impact. And again, different impact across countries. And then back at my local level, John Hattie, who I think would be well known to you through his visible learning work, he put out a report looking at our local situation in Victoria in particular. And what he was saying was that learning didn't decrease that much during COVID, and that any impact on student welfare quickly bounced back when schools were reopened. And he was actually paying homage to the expertise of teachers as the main reason why this occurred. Now, again, keep in mind that in Australia, in Victoria, we did have major periods of lockdown, but we also switched to remote learning, and so learning continued. He did talk in this paper about how schooling may change, so the grammar of schooling before and the new syntax of learning after. And there's something for you to think about. So what's going to change as a result of this experience that we've got? In terms of system and country responses to COVID, again, we've talked about this, school closure. One of the things that I wanted to raise you, that again, across the world, this has been quite different. So Uganda, on January 10, Uganda opened its schools for the first time in 83 weeks. So their schools have been shut for 83 weeks. And and when I say shut, for most of the students in Uganda, that meant no schooling, because the infrastructure is not there in Uganda to support a switch to remote learning in any meaningful way. In India, schools have been closed for 82 weeks, and in Delhi, they are still closed as of last week, I believe. They're still having trouble getting their schools open. And that's to do with COVID. In Delhi, it's also to do with problems with pollution and things like that. But across the world, some jurisdictions have had major periods of closure. And for many students, that has meant no school. So that's a major impact. Remote learning has varied in quality and extent. And again, a variety of technology has been used. Physical schooling for some children has been maintained. So in Victoria, we had our schools closed to most students, but if you were a child of an essential worker or a child with special circumstances, you actually provided with a physical school to go to. Many infrastructure issues, and we talk about internet, we talk about computer technology, but in many countries, we're talking about no electricity. I don't know if you've been keeping up with the desperate situation in Beirut at the moment, but in Beirut, they're getting electricity for 4 hours a day. This is a major capital city of a well-developed country, and their electricity is in such poor state that they've only got 4 hours of electricity a day. Many jurisdictions like Australia rely on international students, and of course those international enrolments have stopped. And so that's impacting. The idea of learning loss has been problematic because of lack of good data, the ongoing cycling of school closures, the differential impact of different schooling, and so forth. Again, I think Parsi will be talking more about this later. Just in terms of when we look at school closures, it is interesting to get people's perception. And so in Australia, we've had these academics look at the impact of school closure in terms of perception of teachers and perception of parents. And generally speaking, there's been a positive response. Most saying that, look, the remote schooling was successful to some degree, not entirely, but certainly it wasn't a disaster. So in terms of the pandemic and how we responded, my challenge to you is to think about what are going to be the enduring changes from this. And some people have been talking about transformation. So people like Alma Harris in the UK have been talking about this as an opportunity for transformation. I'm not inclined to think of it as transformation. I'm thinking it more as an opportunity for evolution and for kickstarting some of the things that we've wanted to do or progressing them more rapidly. And this is because the evidence is that education is actually one of those wonderful things in a society that changes a little bit slower. And this is, I think, a fortunate and positive aspect to a society. So we have some things that change a little bit slow while other things rapidly change around us. And I think that slowness will allow us to think about the best things that we want to take away. And so this brings me to this notion of best practice. So if we're thinking about what might come out of this, well, these are the sorts of things that we'd want. We'd want to reduce inequitable education. We're going to keep using technology, so let's get better at it. There'll be more in-person and virtual remote learning, and that will depend on the education sector. Certainly at university, I'm not sure that I'll ever teach just an in-person class. I think it will always be in-person and some people on remote. So I'll have my roomies and my zoomies, for example. A greater focus on student engagement, agency, and inclusion. A physical school system will remain important. Early years, primary, secondary, that will remain important. I think it's actually being reinforced. I think we're actually seeing that the physical school system is even more important than we thought. But in some education contexts, we will have to get used to this notion of workers not coming into work so much. So blended home office work arrangements. Certainly at my university, we're talking about maybe having people in for 3 days a week at most. In terms of educational leadership, greater focus on moral purpose, trust and values, leadership views, more future responsive, crisis ready, contextually sensitive, more collaborative, collective, dispersed situation, and looking at new ways of working. And finally, greater involvement of more people. Because we've got more people exercising leadership, we'll need more leadership development, and this will have to be planned. And so therefore, rapid professional learning support will be important. No real consensus about what types of ways we might think about leadership. I think a variety of ways will be important. And I just want to conclude then by just talking to you briefly about best practice and next practice ideas. Right, best practice, we know, they're the things that we see around and people say, yeah, this is the way to do things. Now, these emerge over time. So we get a bit of evidence about things. I think this is a great idea. What evidence do we know? And then more people use it and something, yet we come to agreement, this is the way we should do things. And then from time to time, there are things that emerge as being next practice ideas that we weren't really aware of until they've appeared. So let me just show you. So best practice, our current practice is linked to the past. It's linked to what's happening around us, so the best practices, and we make sense of that. But then sometimes there are these next practices, Bitcoin and the virtual currencies. They're probably an example. 10 years ago, most of us didn't know about Bitcoin or similar. We didn't know that they were going to exist. In sport, I don't know if you're paying attention to high jumping, but this guy Fosbury in the '68 Mexico Olympics jumped a different way over the high jump. And from then on, forever, the high jump was changed. He essentially went over backwards when everyone was going over forward. So their next practice, and largely those things, they jump out at you and you go, wow. Sometimes the next practices, though, are an emergence of ideas. And so in this one, I've got the next practices connected. And these are things like the share. So we had taxis in the past, and now we have Uber and other shared ride services. They're not unlike taxis, but they do it differently. In terms of hotels, we now have the competitor through Airbnb, not unlike hotels, but they do it differently. And so we can think about this and then I encourage you to think, okay, 10 years, 20 years, can you have a vision for education for you in 10 or 20 years' time? So if I was going to do that, these are some of the things that I'd want to see. So I think across the world, we really do want to see universal access from primary and secondary. We have it at primary largely, and we're not there at secondary, not across the world, we're not. So we still need that. We need to connect health and welfare services with schools better. I think in 20 years' time, schools will have an even stronger physical. I don't think they're going to vanish. Hopefully, the quality of the buildings and grounds will be better. Hopefully, schools will be even more joyful and humane places, and this strong sense of community. I've got to say, I'm at an age where I still remember going to school and getting strapped because you were naughty. Now, the thought of strapping students now is something that most people can't even comprehend. So we are getting better at these joyful and humane places. The technologies, of course, are going to be better, and they're going to allow us to be more personalised in what we do with students. We're going to cater for student diversity better and better. Teachers will have an enhanced role. I fully believe that teachers as professionals will become even more important. The networks that schools have will become greater. This sense of community will be more important, and that will have different governance arrangements. And the school review group in Bahrain, will be aware of the various government arrangements. So again, those governance arrangements will change. And then for leadership, just quickly, values and beliefs will be important. Leadership will need to be more future focused, not so much concerned with management in the day-to-day, but more future focused, more agile. So we'll expect complexity. We will expect more things to deal with. Leadership roles, you'll be expected to be leaders, not managers, not administrators, but leaders in the sense of how we talk about it. And involvement. Hierarchies won't disappear, but more will be involved in the leadership of schools. Greater complexity and collaboration through technology. And I think in countries like Australia, but Canada, the US, Taiwan, Indigenous perspectives are becoming much more influential. And I think those will continue to evolve. And so,
excuse me, excuse me, David, we have 5 minutes more.
I'm actually just about finished. So I think I've actually caught you up on time. So my call to you is that I think that probably we're seeing an acceleration of trends that we've probably already see as evident, rather than a major transformation. And really, the call is, do you agree with that? And then what's missing? So in my list, what else would you want to put into your list? And really, I just want to encourage you to think in terms of that 10, 20-year vision as an educator for yourself. And I think this helps you in guiding your actions by doing that. And I think the pandemic has been an ideal opportunity for us to think about, well, what is happening with education? Where do we want to go with it? And again, I think Parsi is going to be talking about some of those things that we need to go to look at. I'll just conclude. There are 4 issues of the journal that I mentioned that you can get from that address, and you can get a chapter that I've written, which is largely to the presentation that I've said. I've also listed a few other things on the presentation that you can follow up with, and I'll thank you for the opportunity. Thanks to my colleague Laurie Drysdale for helping with the design and always with my thinking. And I will stop it at that. Paula, how's that? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry for that. Thank you so much, David, for being very punctual and really finishing within the allocated time here. And definitely your input is quite important, and I'm sure that would encourage our colleagues to ask questions and to pass their comments, which we are all waiting for. طبعا سلط المتحدث الضوء في عرضه على ما تسببت به الجائحة من آثار إيجابية وسلبية على عملية التعليم وانعكاساتها على الطلبة والمعلمين ومنفعة المؤسسات التعليمية، كما أولت الدراسة اهتماماً كبيراً بأهمية الرعاية الصحية والنفسية للطلبة في فترة تعلمهم إبان الجائحة، مستعرضاً أبرز استجابات الدول وممارسات القيادات التربوية فيها لتعويض الفاقد التعليمي وتلبية احتياجات الطلبة التعليمية بفئاتهم المختلفة، والوصول في نهاية المطاف لتخطيط مستقبلي لأفضل الممارسات القادمة. اخواني وخواتي الحضور، للتذكير لازلنا نستقبل اسئلتكم وتعليقاتكم باللغتين العربيه والانجليزيه من خلال خانه الQ&A. رجاء الاستفاده من هذه الفرصه حتى تعمل فائده للجميع. Just before proceeding with the second session of the day, I'd like to remind you that questions in both English and Arabic are still welcomed. Kindly use the Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to start our second session, entitled The Problem of Achievement Gap and What to Do with It. This session is presented by Professor Pasi Selberg from Finland, who is currently a professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Pasi is specialized in different areas, such as educational change, school improvement, and organization theory, with an experience of over 36 years. The mic is yours, Pasi.
Yes, thank you. Marhaba. Good afternoon, everyone, from Sydney, Australia, some 1,000 kilometers north from where David was talking to you. I'm sitting here in the beautiful part of this country, Australia. This is a Gadigal land, and I also want to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and if there are any First Nations colleagues and friends following this presentation, I want to extend these respects to them as well. David, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's a really good lead to what I have to say. You made a number of connections already to what I have to say. I really appreciate your focus on leadership, and I think it's a critically important part of this whole conversation, this critical conversation here. And I think if the pandemic and this disruption has done anything significant, it has also elevated the importance of leadership of all levels, but particularly in education. So I really enjoyed your work, and I try to bring a kind of a complement what David was saying from the leadership point of view, and hopefully help you to understand a little bit also about these things that I think that we need to be focusing on, whether you are leading the system of schools, or your school principal, or even a leader at the classroom level. I think these ideas that we are talking about are relevant for everyone. So let me as well. I'm gonna share my slides. I hope that you can see my slides right now. So I have organized my 26 minutes that I have left into basically 3 themes, and the overall idea is to talk about the achievement gap. That is a main theme of this webinar, but also from bring a kind of a critical perspective to this learning loss thing that David was mentioning. So, but I want to start with the very important notion to me, and I guess all of us, is this question that what was the state of education before this pandemic started almost exactly 2 years ago? And if we were having this webinar 2 years ago, nobody would have any idea what's going to happen within the next 24 months. But my argument here is that it's extremely important to keep this in mind, that we had a education globally that was not necessarily in a very good condition, and we had a number of global issues that we need to keep in mind they haven't disappeared anywhere, just like David was saying, that some of them have been have been amplified during this last 2 years. And then I make some comments about this learning loss thing. I actually call it a myth. Personally, I don't like the term at all. I think it's a wrong term, and I'm going to explain to you why I think so. My fear is that if we continue talking about focusing this learning loss, we could probably going to do more harm and damage to children and our school systems than good things. And then finally, some conclusions about the future. How do we, just like David gave to you some thoughts. So I hope that you are able to, follow my thinking in this very, very short presentation, and I invite you to come back with the questions and comments. So let's start with this question of what education look like globally. I'm not looking at Bahrain or Australia or Finland, but if we look at the big picture education just before this pandemic hit. Now, the good news is that we have more fairly reliable information and statistics and data about education globally now than ever before. So we are not able to paint a completely accurate and up-to-date picture of each and every country and part of the world, but we have never known so much about how education systems operate and work than we do now. And so that's why this data and information that we can use to answer this question, that what was the state of education before pandemic, is a fairly easy thing to do right now because of the access to this data. So I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. Just refer to the three big players in this global scene, namely UNESCO, OECD, and the World Bank, and they all have been working a number of years already with this question of what is happening around the world in education. And I'm going to show you very quickly what these organizations concluded just before the pandemic hit 2 years ago. Just to make my point that we had serious questions that we needed to keep in mind. First of all, what the UNESCO has been doing through its global education monitoring process is to look at the issues like access, participation in education. And just before the pandemic, the UNESCO reported that there are 260 million children and young people who were not in school. It's a fairly large number of kids who should be studying, but they were not. And this number has remained fairly large during the last 20 years, regardless of the efforts and programs and campaigns that we have had. And then, then the OECD is one of those organizations that is primarily looking at the wealthier part of the countries, the OECD member countries, 37 nations currently. And the OECD's emphasis during the last 10 years really has been to look at these achievement gaps, how differently children from different socioeconomic groups, for example, or equity groups are performing in different education systems. And the OECD has repeatedly been reminding that if we look at the 15-year-olds in different countries, or the OECD as a family of nations, this achievement gap equals to about 3 years of learning at the age of 15. So it means that we have students there who are 15 who actually learn at the level of 18-year-olds or 12-year-olds or something like this. So the gap has been huge, and then there's a World Bank that it has been looking at this whole thing like a more globally, including all the countries. The World Bank called this in its Human Development Report a couple of years ago a global learning crisis, looking at this access and participation, learning outcomes, and also this equity or inequality issue. So just a reminder that when we went into this pandemic, that we had the global education that was not really in a strong condition. My fear is, and it becomes evident in some of the narratives and reports, is that we seem to be kind of forgetting these things and paying attention to some of the immediate immediate issues that the pandemic has created that may be important, but so are these things that, if we don't fix these previous problems, it's going to be very difficult to make education much better. So I'm going to show you very quickly some of these, what does it look like, so that I can make my point clear. So what the OECD, for example, has been doing during the last 20 years is to look at the 15-year-olds' performance in academic subjects in the school, reading and mathematics and science. And this is what the trend looks like if we put a kind of a rough picture of the OECD countries and some of the partnership countries' performance. So if you look at this quickly, you see that starting from year 2000 all the way until the present year, this average performance within the OECD has been declining. If we look at the countries separately, there may be some outliers, some different performances, but many education systems fall very nicely into this image. Australia is one of them, Finland is one of them, Canada, and many other nations have been following the same trend. And now what makes this thing problematic is this one. That at the same time, during the last 20 years, we have been spending more, sometimes significantly more money per student in order to get these outcomes. And this, of course, is something that is very difficult, hard to explain. How can it be that we spend more money but get less out of this? And this is something that we need to pay attention to this, because we cannot continue like this, that more money is going to education, we get less outcomes. Of course, there are many other outcomes in education than just the academic things, but these are often those that are considered to be important. The second thing that we can focus on in this pre-pandemic thing is the students' well-being, and this is again the kind of a rough image globally. This very closely illustrates the situation in many countries, including my old home country, Finland, and many countries in Europe, certainly here in Australia, United States, Canada, that the children's well-being and health has been steadily declining. And there are many symptoms, many reasons why this has happened. I'm not going to go into that right now. And just one second. I have some issues here. Sorry. At the same time, we have seen that the children's how children behave, how they spend their free time, for example, has also significantly changed. But there's most of the kids, and I have two of them here at home. They spend much more time every day, sitting down, often glued to the screens, and many kids spend more time on, doing homework, and much less time outdoors and physical activities and so on. So that's something that is, and I'm not arguing here that there's a particularly necessarily causal link between these two things that you can see here, but these have just happened simultaneously, and these are something that we need to do something, just like David was talking about the importance of education and health being seen in a much more coordinated way as accessible for all the children. So this is one of those things that we need to keep in mind. So as a kind of a conclusion from this first part of the my presentation is this, that we need to understand these pre-pandemic problems and challenges. They have not gone away. Many of these things that we have seen here, including the well-being of children and health, they have just declined and become worse. We have to fix this. We have to be aware of these things and do something about these things, rather than rush to do something that we can immediately see and is visible in this pandemic era. So this is a very important notion of the kind of a program, the future work that we need to do. Let me say a few things about this learning loss and why do I call it a myth. My simple argument here is that how can we call something loss if we have never owned it? And because for me, loss is something that you had it, and then you kind of seem to be losing that. But if the kids have not learned something, they cannot lose it. And so we need to use another term, and but then we come to a different types of conversations. But this is something that that John Ewing, who's the president of the Math for America, obviously a math person, wrote in Forbes magazine about a year ago. He said something like this, that learning is complicated. Plutarch famously wrote that minds are not vessels to be filled, but fires to be kindled. Fires don't leak. You don't measure them in months, just like we have tried to measure this learning loss in the months. Learning loss is a calculation masquerading as a concept, a rather shallow, naive, ridiculous concept. And in many ways, I kind of understand the thing that this learning loss narrative and rhetoric has been brought in by those who are very much in favor of measuring everything, standardized assessments and tests that can serve and help in many other things. But it's not the thing we need right now and right here. So for me, if you ask that, so what could be the learning loss, or what could it look like? You know, the real learning loss for me is something like this. If you have been a teacher, and I've been teaching mathematics and science in Finland for many years, and I know this, and any teacher will know this as well, that at the time when you teach something, let's say mathematics, and if you do it well, and if you practice and rehearse, most of your students, they probably learn what they're supposed to learn. So the kind of a learned knowledge and skills at the moment of teaching and immediately after teaching is fairly good. So you can say that most of my students, they understand and they learned what they're supposed to learn. But then we do know that when the time goes by, let's say 12 months later, many of these kids, sometimes and often in school, most of the kids have lost a significant amount of that stuff that they learn. The question is whether they ever learn it in the first place if you kind of lose it. But this type of thing where we are looking at kind of losing something that you were supposed to learn is a learning loss, where you had something and then you don't have it anymore and you kind of lose it. And I think that we should be much more concerned about this type of learning loss and ask ourselves that, are we organizing schools in a way that kids actually can learn and understand meaningfully what we are doing there, rather than link the learning loss to something else. And let me show you this as well, because I spoke a little bit about this international measurements earlier. This comes from the OECD's database as well, and I think this is quite interesting notion here. I have combined here all the OECD countries together, so I'm not looking at any particular country, Australia, Finland, or anything like that. In year 2000, 20 years ago, when the first OECD PISA results were released, this was one of the big news, is that this achievement gap between the poorest and the most affluent students across the OECD equaled about 3 years. It's a huge gap, 3 years of schooling. And this is what has happened during the last 20 years. So we have been doing these PISA tests in every 3 years, and nothing has changed during the 20 years within the OECD as a whole. So we still have this big achievement gap that equals to about 3 years of schooling, and we kind of tolerate that. So my question is that why we haven't done anything to this. We have known this here in Australia and in most other countries, but we haven't really done anything much about this thing. And this could be seen also as a learning loss, but I call it a achievement gap here. So instead, I think the narrative we educators need to exercise much more than this learning loss is to talk about learning gains during this pandemic, because many students, and we know this very well, if you are close to the schools or if you're parents, you understand that the students have learned many things during this pandemic. They have learned about themselves, their resiliency, and how to adapt to new situations. They have been able to learn to create new things and ideas, communicate, use the technologies, and they have learned about the family dynamics, how important it is to be with others. And my fear is that this negative narrative of losing something or being left behind, if we kind of bring it too much, too kind of too powerful in these post-pandemic things, that many of these kids, they probably learn that they they probably haven't learned anything during this pandemic, and this is not true. Some of the early evidence already showing, for example, the study is done in Finland, where the school closures were nothing like we heard from David in India or Uganda. But the interesting things are that some of those kids who didn't go to school, they actually learned more. They gained during this disruption and pandemic, and some of the kids, of course, they lost something. And so let me come to the conclusion. I have a couple of more minutes to go, but I want to look at this future, just like David was talking about this 20 years perspective. But I'm just want to kind of ask this question that, so how do we use this crisis to make the world better through education? And one of those questions is, of course, it's a classical question here, and every educator, a school leader, or anybody who's working in the administration is asking that. So what are those things that influence student achievement in the school? So how do we maximize the student learning and student outcomes? And again, this is not my research. This is something that has been researched during the last 50 or 60 years intensively around the world. And we do know that the teacher influence actually is not that huge in this overall cake or pie of all the other influences. That we have the in-school influences that includes teacher and then the leadership and others in-school factors together constitute about 1/4 of the influence. By far, this blue part of the pie, that is about 60% of influence, is something that teachers and schools have very little control of. That those are the variables outside of the school gate: the community, the family, the parents' education, the peer group, and many other things. And that's why I'm saying this, because now when we are looking to the future, and I just like David said, I think this is an extremely important question to say that. So what are we going to do? The one thing that we need to do, of course, is to make sure that our teachers are able to do what they need to do in the school. But we cannot expect that just by fixing the teachers or improving the teachers, we can improve the systems. That's not going to happen. Just like the research and evidence is saying that because of the teacher influence is about 10 to 15% on average, obviously varies from situation to situation. The majority of the opportunities to improve education, the quality of education system, are found in the system level conditions, not necessarily in the school. Don't hear me wrongly, because I think that the teachers and principals and school curriculum and those things are extremely important. But if we really want to change the education system, improve the system, we need to do much more than that. So here is my. I'm just going to show you this once again. David referred to McKinsey, and I want to do the same thing, but now just kind of raise my concern or question about any of these types of predictions that you may have seen. This is what the McKinsey did for the administrators and decision makers in the United States. If you look at these numbers, how much would it cost to do something like try to fix these learning loss things? These are ridiculous amounts of money, $40 to $60 billion in a country like United States for a 6 months intervention or 1 or 2 interventions. And I think we need to stay away from these types of treatments and expectations that by doing this alone would be able to fix the systems. Honestly, I think that, if anybody has a $40 to $60 billion extra money to spend on education, it should be spent on try to improve the system and try to fix some of these pre-existing inequalities and things. For example, doing something to prevent these inequalities and issues happening, like making sure that the education system is designed in a way that it's able to intervene early on and address these learning difficulties and problems that have existed before and will continue to exist. Many education systems are still working in this kind of a mode of repair, that we start to do something when the problem has already happened. Very few education systems actually has been designed in a way that it's more about prevention. And the Finland's education system, you may have different views about that, but Finland's education system is one of those examples, and other Nordic systems as well, where there's a lot of preventive measures built into the school system that try to help kids to stay away from these troubles. The closer collaboration between education and health, or learning and well-being, is critically important. I would probably take this a step further than what David was saying, and insist that that school should be the primary place for each and every child everywhere, where they can learn the skills of health and well-being, so that health would be a skill rather than only something that we do on kids when they are not feeling well. For me personally, health is one of the most important 21st century skills, and the school is a good place to learn the kind of the foundational things about that. And then finally, I think we need to enhance the quality of education systems through investing more smartly and intelligently in the equity of the system. And this, of course, this is the story that requires another webinar. But just I want to emphasize here the importance of also improving the whole system rather than just the single parts and elements of the system. So here's my conclusion. The echoes that come from the half a century research and much of the work that has been done ever since remind us again and again that the child's learning is a function more of the characteristics of his classmates and the community than those of the teacher. Again, teachers are important, but the much more powerful influence that the affects kids' learning in the school at the level of the system are those that they live with every day. And what the OECD has been reminding us for about the last 15 years is that the highest performing education systems across the OECD are those that combine quality with equity. Equity work is still undermined in many education systems, many societies, and I think that it's a good way and good investment for more sustainable future. So I stop here and thank you very much for your attention. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations with all of us.
Bowen. Okay, hello. Can you hear me? Yeah? Am I back? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Pasi, for your presentation and for highlighting such critical issues. بس طبعا للجمهور نحب نقدم ملخص لأبرز ما جاء في ورقة البروفيسور باسي. استعرض المتحدث التحديات والفرص استعرض المتحدث التحديات والفرص أمام دعم تعلم الطلبة ورعايتهم خلال الجائحة، مركزاً على أهمية الاستفادة من الإخفاقات الهيكلية لأنظمتنا الحالية، معتبراً أن الأزمات تخلق فرصاً جديدة عوضاً عن الاندفاع للقيام بحلول واستثمارات غير مدروسة الآن في مجال التعليم لحل ما يعرف بخرافة إشكالية الفاقد التعليمي، حيث اكتسب العديد من الطلبة إبانة تعلمهم في هذه الفترة المرونة في التعلم والقدرة على التكيف وأساسيات الصحة العامة والتعامل مع تقنيات الاتصال وقيمة الأسرة. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we shall start with the questions and answers. Thank you first of all for your contributions. طبعا في مجموعة من الأسئلة والتعليقات وردتنا من الجمهور خلال هذا اللقاء. We will start our first question to you, David. how can the obstacle of assessment integrity be resolved? Do you believe that skill-based standardized tests should be changed to fit the current educational loss faced by students across the globe?
Right. So my comment about the integrity was to do with the switch to remote learning. So it was more to do with, so at the university level, our students have been taking their exams sitting in their home. So how do we know that they're doing the right thing? So it's not a really a general question about assessment. I personally believe we over-assess. We do too much. We assess everything, and we spend so much time assessing that sometimes I wonder how much time we've got to actually learn.
True.
But so yeah, again, my comment was about when you go to remote learning and you've still got your old practices in place, you've got to redo things. So we need more innovative ways of assessing, probably.
Yeah.
And we also need to get better at assessing, a broader range of things, but not over assessing. But so creativity, for example, we don't need really to assess creativity, but we want students to be more creative, and so they need some feedback about that. So how do we give people feedback about how they're developing their creativity? It's kind of not quite assessment. It's more the hatty, the feedback idea. Yeah.
True. Yeah, I can't agree more with you. Now, I received a question for Pasi here regarding the educational world rapidly moving towards technology integration, something you tackled, and the fact that students' well-being is declining. How can all the related issues, such as lack of physical activity, increasing screen time, and homework pressure, how can we tackle those issues in such a crazy world where technology is integrating everywhere?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. I think it's a great example of these important things that are not entirely within the reach of the school. So if you ask this question from what the school can do, I think the best thing that the schools can do, or any individual school can do, is to work more closely with the parents and the families with this thing, because they are, the parents are the first educators of their children, or first teachers of their children, and they often decide what their children do and how they spend their time. And I've done a lot of research and work here, including here and in Australia and Canada, on these issues, and it's very difficult to change these things unless both parents and the school understand what needs to be done. Actually, our research here in Australia indicates an interesting thing. It is that when we ask parents this question, the parents are saying that we would love to have more engagement by our teachers and schools to help us to, have more play, more physical activity, and movement, and kind of a healthy lifestyle, and less screen time and those things. Then when we ask teachers the same thing, they say exactly the same thing, that we would love to have parents more engaged and helping us in this. So it's a kind of a good news is that the will is there, that we adults, we want to do something, and now it's just to find a way how we do this at the level of the communities. I do not personally believe that any administration or ministry or department of education can do much with this. This is something that is typically a kind of a grassroots issue that can only be solved at the grassroots level activity. So my advice would be for anyone, and the person who was asking this, is that, take this question that you were asking here to the conversations at the community level or the school level. Engage young people as well, because they, in the end of the day, they will decide, what to do, and make sure that everybody understands what is at stake. Everybody understands that, why it's not necessarily a good idea to have less physical activity or no physical activity. Why is it not a good idea to spend 8 hours a day with the screen based gadgets? Why is it not a good idea that the young people who should be sleeping now 9 hours a day only sleep 5 hours a day. And then, based on these conversations, parents together with the educators and schools and the community to decide to do something. And I still want to underline the importance of having young people engaged in this. Young people are really smart today. They understand that, if we try to do something on them without asking them, they're not going to do that. They're not going to bite in. And at the same time, if we are engaging them and asking, their views, that how would you, change this situation? How would you improve the quality of our lives? They often come up with the very interesting and creative things. And so that's why I think the only way to do this is to have better conversations, more inclusive conversations, and engage young people themselves to find a better way to do things.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Can I just jump in and just give you a very simple example? So I was reviewing a school and challenging context, poor area, and I noticed all the kids at recess and lunchtime were playing. And I thought, this is unusual. What the school did, it had a huge container which had balls in it. Had all sorts of balls, basketballs, various types of footballs, tennis balls. They were freely available to students. So it didn't matter if you had no money, you could still get a ball. And there was no accountability. It was expected the ball was returned. If it didn't get returned, they filled it up. And just a beautiful example of how you can cover equity and quality with a simple act.
True. Yeah. Thank you for that. I have a question from Sajida Khan, and she is directing the question to you, David, again. She's asking here, do you have any data available showing the overall learning loss that has happened during the pandemic? Any clue on how one can really get to know that?
Yeah, okay. So if we're picking up Parsi's point,
there's no loss.
The question is actually
That's
wrong.
The problem today. We have... Okay,
yeah.
That's why I directed the question to you, David.
Yeah, and look, so again, in the Australian context, when we say schools were closed, they were never really closed. And for most students, schools continued. We have pretty good infrastructure, and even in communities where there's not a lot of money, the governments were providing devices to students and homes. Maybe they didn't have the internet and so forth, but on the whole, Australia was pretty good at continuing schooling. When you go to a country like Uganda, and again, think of the inequity of wealth in a country like India, it becomes more problematic when schools are closed. And so in Uganda, I mentioned 83 weeks, but the really important part of that conversation was that they thought that up to 30% of students would in fact be lost to education. They actually wouldn't return to schooling ever. So in that way, you've actually got a major education crisis happening in Uganda, in that there's a significant cohort of students who won't get to the level of education that you would like as a country. And so again, it just depends on your context. So really, you need to look at your own context in Bahrain to see, where the gaps are in your education. But to look at the global statistics, it's very tricky and probably misleading. And again, that concept of learning loss is not really. So what's the learning gain, and how much have we helped students?
Yeah, if I can add here, because it's exactly like what you said, David. That I think the first, and I'm not undermining this, that how much schooling kids have lost, particularly in the cases like you mentioned, the Uganda or some other places. But I think that in every context, I think the smarter first question would be that what did you learn during the pandemic?
True.
And I'm quite sure that almost every child has a story to tell. And I'm quite sure that almost all of those stories are something that the teacher or parent would not kind of expect to hear. And, for example, if you look at the OECD just published, I think last week, a joint publication with I think it was the World Bank and some other organizations, where they are listing these, I think there are 45 different innovations about what has kept the learning going on around the world. And there are amazing things there, and mostly in developing part of the world, that what happened when the disruption, closed the school buildings, but the learning didn't stop. That they, the people kind of realized that they need to keep on doing these things. And I think that, hearing those stories that often come with this idea that, we are all born in this need to learn. That every child, when we were born, that our kind of an innate basic need was to learn new things, and it doesn't go away. Often it happens that when we go to school, that it kind of disappears there, because the way we expect kids to learn in the school is a very different way than the kids learn in a natural place. So that's why let's ask first that, what did you learn and what did you gain, and what were the new things that you realized during this time, and listen to these kids and listen to their stories. And only then afterwards, a kind of a worry about, do you have all these things, knowledge and skills that you need to be able to learn and do the maths and those things. But I think that many of those these positive stories that we have kids saying are more important in the end of the day than any of these possible losses, or if somebody's left behind a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I have a question for you, Pasi. It says here, based on your views on learning loss, if there is a delay in learning essential skills, how to deal with it while all children are not still back to schools?
Yeah, again, it's not a learning loss, because as I said, that you're going to lose something that you never had. But the question is more about, how much and which ways do we need to help those young people who are really left behind, in the sense that they, for example, don't have some basic essential knowledge and skills that they need in order to move forward. But again, what we have learned during this pandemic from different experiments and case studies around the world is that individual children are very, very differently experiencing these things. As I said earlier, that there are some studies that show that those kids that were left behind when they were in the school, in their learning, that they were learning slowly, and often considered as low achievers, that when they were not in this place called school and in this social environment, they actually flourished, that they needed a different environment to learn these things. And then, of course, there are many kids who cannot do much in, again, mathematics or academic stuff without being with the educated and prepared teachers there. So, my response to this is that we need to look at these things in the individual level. And that's why, what is critically important in this post-pandemic recovery is to have well-prepared, educated professional teachers in each and every school and classroom. Yeah. And it's almost like a health expert's job to ask teachers to use their professional judgment and understanding and expertise to answer these questions, that what is the best thing for each and every child. I think we're gonna make a major mistake and lose a lot of money if we try to use some statistical and average interventions and treatments to try to deal with these things. I think this is much more personalized or individualized approach that we need to do.
Thank you for that. I received a comment and a question, and it seems very interesting here. How can we admit that there is no educational loss while there are some students who lack devices needed for remote learning? This is one. And learning and activities provided don't focus on writing. This must be a language teacher. So writing skills are underdeveloped no matter how we tried. And we are not really sure that students are committed during those lessons, whether they are virtual lessons here we're talking about, when they are doing those tasks. I mean, this is a big issue here, isn't it?
I think, yeah, and David can say more about this, but I think this is a pretty much a equity or inequality issue as well, that how much different individuals and students are supported when they're learning from home. But it's also an issue of, I think it's a good example of the, if there's such thing as a universal culture of schooling or school learning that is almost everywhere based on the idea that kids will only learn when there's a teacher or adult who will tell them what to do next. And there are very few education systems actually that would systematically prepare young children, starting from preschool, to learn, own their own learning and lead their own learning, and even when the teacher disappears, that they would keep on going in their own learning. So I think that we are a little bit handicapped with this current culture or traditional culture of schooling that assumes that learning can only happen when there's somebody teaching the kids, when it should be that the learning goes on, and that the adults and teachers and parents or technology is just providing support and help. But David, do you must have a view on this question as well?
Yeah, true.
So I've probably reviewed over 100 schools, mainly in Victoria, but interstate and overseas as well. And one of the things when I've been doing that work is I ask schools to think of the type of student that comes out of their school. So for however long that student's with them, whether it's 7 years, 6 years, 13 years, or a shorter period, what experiences do they have at the school? What sort of learning context? What excursions? What activities? How do you develop? And what's the young person like that comes out of the school? And I think for all of us as educators, that's what we need to consider. So someone graduating at the end of this year, academic year, what do they look like? What's their experience been? And if there's been something missing, can we try and accommodate that and help them with that? Or is it something that we can let go? So for example, with school lockdowns, school productions haven't happened. Plays, musicals. Now, for many students, that's a really key part of their time. So I was a maths teacher too, Parsi, and I always said to people didn't come to period 6 on a Friday to do maths with me. They came to school to do all the other things, and that allowed me to teach maths in period 6 on a Friday. Well, there are a few kids that love maths, but mostly, that students come to school for all these other things. So again, I just encourage educators, think of the young person coming out of your school. What have they experienced? Is there something that's missing from that experience that you can either let go or that you need to do now in the immediate future to help them? And I think if we keep that in mind, we don't get so hung up on 3 months behind in something. And even the mechanical things like writing skills. The question for you, if someone hasn't done it for a while, can they quickly and I think you see that particularly if you think of the US context where they have that really long summer break, it's always been one of the things in the US context. They always complain, the teachers always complain, students know nothing when they come back after that really long 3-month break. But then they adapt. The teachers have always adapted. They complain, but then they just get on, and of course there is no real problem. So again, I think it's reflecting on the young people and the experiences and responding, and again, context specific.
True. Yeah, I think most of the teachers attending today are really concerned when it comes to the loss of test data. They are asking the question, how can the loss of test data be rectified for the pandemic years? What alternatives can we use then? Being math specialists, people love grading and.
So what's the purpose of the test data is the first question. And if there is a real purpose for it, then you might need to find an alternative. If there's not a real purpose to it, then you're probably okay. Yeah. But like if it's a selection thing, if it's a basis for how you structure your curriculum and things like that, then you'll want to do some testing. So many of our schools going from primary to secondary, they'll test the primary students with a couple of standardized tests in English and mathematics, just so they know what the cohort is like. And they often modify their program. So that would still be important. If you didn't have that, you wouldn't be doing the modification. But then you can do that test whenever you get the kids. So I think it's a really, what's the purpose of the test? And is it a critical test, or is it just something you can let go?
Yeah. Well, Pasi, if you don't have anything to add to that, maybe we can ask one final question here, or just raise this with you. With the audience, and I'm sure this is a teacher, how can we communicate effectively with students to care for their well-being and empower them during this difficult time. Any hints in here?
Well, I mean,
you have to communicate.
The most obvious thing is teachers do that all the time. That's what
exactly.
they do. So whether it's remote or whether it's in person, that's what teachers.
But it is more. I think it's more essential now than ever. I mean,
yes,
communication has to go on now, no matter what. Yeah.
I wrote a paper many years ago about e-leadership, and this is going back nearly 20 years now. And one of the fascinating things at that time was in remote environments like this, it actually said that the personal side of things was more important than if it was face-to-face. Because when you're face-to-face, you get a lot of cues from that face-to-face interaction, where we're sitting in little boxes now. And so sometimes it's, hey, how are you going, Parsi? Have you got a comment to make? Like just checking in on people more and more. And again, I think the teachers have been, people I know have actually been really good at doing that in systematic ways. At a leadership level, a lot of principals have got really tired because they're concerned about that. They're concerned in checking on their teachers. They're concerned about checking on their families, and they're just wearing themselves out. So that's another side to it. I mean, you've got to look after yourself as a professional as well.
True. Anything from your side, Pasi, to add to this?
Yeah, no, I think that, the opportunity we have now when I guess most education systems and nations are thinking about this recovery in education as well, that there has been good experiences, and we have evidence about that basically around the world, of this self-initiated learning and student-led activities or self-directed learning, if you wish, that we have been trying around the world to install in schools for the last 100 years, and it hasn't happened. And I think that if we understand the value of this opportunity, and if we can in education systems do even a little bit in that way, that try to think about schools, and talking about evolution, David is quite okay in this respect, to give more space to this student-led initiative, student agency when it comes to learning. I think we not only that we're going to get better learning outcomes in the long run, but we're going to have much better prepared education systems for the next crisis, whether it's another virus or whether it's the environmental catastrophe or political thing or something like this, because something's going to happen. I don't know when.
True.
But this is not the only time when the schools are disrupted, and already the early evidence is showing that those education systems where students have been guided and encouraged and coached to take the responsibility of their own learning a little bit more and lead their own exploration and use their own curiosity, that they seem to be able to manage a little bit better this type of complex disruption that has happened. So my kind of a hope would be that every single teacher and every single school would also have a conversation about this, that how can we maintain or even intensify this mode of learning that many young people began to exercise when they were not in school, or when they were doing remote learning, or when all of a sudden something happened, and just show them that learning is something that you have to do, you have to initiate, you have to keep it going, rather than something that teacher is doing and then somebody's testing whether you have learned that thing. So we have an opportunity to push this education or learning evolution a little bit faster forward if we want to do that. But we may also miss this opportunity by bringing back some of these old tools and procedures, like heavy standardized testing and teacher-led pedagogy and teaching as a main method of work. So that's why I think it's important to utilize this opportunity we have.
Thank you so much. I can't agree more with you than this. I mean, we almost reached the end of this webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Passy. Thank you so much, David. And allow me, ladies and gentlemen, now to read aloud the recommendations of today's webinar. And those are the closing remarks. 1, developing educational systems to be more flexible in meeting the demands of individual students. 2, adopting more collective, collaborative, and responsive leadership focused on continuous improvement. 3, increasing emphasis on social and emotional well-being of all categories of students and supporting learning in a personalized and authentic manner. 4, adopting integrated assessment methods to ensure validity of achievement and consequent early intervention to address learning difficulties and gaps once occurred. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attendance, and special thanks again go to Professor David and Professor Passy for their valuable contributions to our webinar. ختاما نشكر لكم حضوركم الكريم، مساهماتكم القيمة في إثراء جلستي هذا المنتدى. نستودعكم الرحمن أخواني وأخواتي على أمل اللقاء بكم في فعاليات قادمة. دمتم بخير. Have a very good afternoon, local time. Have a very good evening, your time, and please stay safe. Thank you so much indeed. Have a good night. Bye-bye.